Okay, so we're looking at Peter Beinart's article, which came out a few weeks back, called Yavne, A Jewish Case for Equality in Israel-Palestine. I'm referring to Peter Beinart's longer article in Jewish Currents, and not the shorter version in the New York Times. You are very much invited to read the article yourselves. If you just Google Beinart Jewish Currents Yavne, you'll find it. And what I'm going to try and cover is the main points in Yavne's article and the main critiques of his article coming from other commentators. Okay, so we'll just be starting off. I think that we can roughly say that there are kind of four main points that Beinart is trying to get across in his article. Again, this is the final time I'm going to say it. Feel free to read the article yourselves to get a clearer picture. First of all, I think he's saying that it's about time that the Jewish people and Jewish Israelis stopped being frightened all the time, that we are still carrying with us our fear of the Holocaust, and that's getting in the way of our ability to make progress, and in particular in a progressive fashion. His second point, delivered very powerfully, is we should stop thinking that the occupation of the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza is a temporary thing. It's not temporary, it's permanent. The idea of having two states for two peoples is dead. It's not going to happen. It's never going to happen. The idea of keeping the Jews and the Palestinians separate has failed, and he mostly blames Israelis for it, Israeli Jews for it. And therefore, we are in a permanent situation of military occupation, denial of the rights of Palestinians. He doesn't use the word, but apartheid is not far from the conversation. And bearing that in mind, that is terrible and awful, and we must not accept that Israel, the Zionist dream, is something that brings about the oppression of another people. He says that we need to therefore redefine Zionism as a call for a Jewish home and not a Jewish state. What the state actually needs to be now is a Jewish-Palestinian equal place from the river to the sea. He says that it's time for liberal Zionists to abandon the goal of Jewish-Palestinian separation, i.e. two states, and embrace the goal of Jewish-Palestinian equality. And therefore, he says, we need a Yavne-like paradigm shift, referring to when Judaism effectively changed from a temple-based national religion where sacrifices were made by priests and moved to a rabbinical, home-based synagogue study kind of experience of what it is to be the Jewish people, that we need a total paradigm shift from the way in which we're understanding what's going on in Israel. So, piece by piece, the two-state solution is dead. It is an ex-solution. Ever since the late 70s, in a groundbreaking article by a Palestinian historian, Walid Khalidi, Thinking the Unthinkable, Palestinians have always talked about the idea that if we Palestinians have to accept a state much smaller than the entirety of British Mandate Palestine, in order to accept a mini-state, it still needs to have some territorial contiguity, and we must have complete sovereignty, not quasi-sovereignty or half-sovereignty, but a sovereign, independent Palestinian state. And the problem is that ever since the year 2000, every Israeli offer to the Palestinians of something like a state has been for less and less territory and less sovereignty. To the extent that the Trump plan right now, the land which is offered to the Palestinians is just a complete jigsaw archipelago of little blobs connected by roads which the Israelis would have security control over, and the amount of sovereignty that is being offered is kind of a little bit like a joke. Some have argued that the reason why Israelis have been offering less territory and less sovereignty is because of a security threat, because of Palestinian violence. But what Beinart points out is that Palestinian violence has actually been going down since the year 2005, actually a lot to do with cooperation between the Palestinian security services and the IDF. So actually it's not about violence, it's just that the Israelis don't want the two-state solution to happen. The Palestinian Authority is also not a helpful player in this game. It's a disaster in terms of its corruption. It supports, as Beinart puts it, separation. It's in favour of keeping Palestinians separate from Israelis when Beinart sees that the solution is for equality and not separation. And the longer this situation goes on, the more that Israel and America offer less and less useful, less and less viable understandings of what a Palestinian state will be, more violence will emerge. And as violence increases from the Palestinians, then the call for mass expulsion will increase in the Jewish population. And as he says, annexation is not the end of the line, it is a way station on the road to hell. So Beinart then moves ahead and says, so we need a different vision, and the vision needs to be equality. Not separation, but equality. That we have one state, everyone gets to vote in this one state, and everyone is equal. Which means that the idea of having a Jewish state or a Jewish home does not necessarily entail that another people gets pushed down. And in anticipation of the critics of this crazy idea that all of a sudden the lion is going to lie down with the lamb, in anticipation of people telling him it is a total ridiculous pipe dream what he's talking about, he says, look, today 2 states and 1 equal state are both unrealistic. He's just proved to us that the 2-state solution is a non-starter. It was a starter 20, 30 years ago, but it's never going to happen. So that's unrealistic too. The right question is not which vision is more fanciful at this moment, but which can generate a movement powerful enough to bring fundamental change. And this is where he moves forward to start showing how the idea of one state or one country is not far from the possibility of reality. He points out, first of all, Ayman Ude of the Joint List within Israel. Ayman Ude, the leader of the Arab Joint List Party. So Ayman Ude is very much in favour of equality. In his office, he has posters of Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King, and he talks about safeguarding the rights of vulnerable Jews, even those that were taught to hate us, because they too are worthy of equality. So Ayman Ude, if we're talking about leadership, the moment that you talk about equality rather than separation, then you don't only need to look to the West Bank or Gaza for Palestinian leadership. It could be also Palestinians who are living in Israel proper. He also talks about how when the Joint List proposed a different wording of the nation-state law that affirmed the principle of equal citizenship for every citizen, Democratic senators actually agreed with this idea and thought it was a good idea. He talks about how young Americans now, in latest surveys from 2018, prefer the concept of a one-state outcome rather than to a two-state outcome. Support is rising for the one-state idea among young Palestinians as well. And East Jerusalem could be the vision. It could be, or altogether, Jerusalem could become a model for equal politics in Israel-Palestine. And already, if East Jerusalem Palestinians were to choose to vote now, there would be a huge force. Now, he also knows that there is resistance to the idea of a binational state. And Beinart is trying to address this fear that a binational state would be dangerous, it would be unstable, it would threaten our security. He's saying, you're right, that binational states are often unstable, but Israel is already binational. The entirety of the land from the river to the sea is controlled by the Jews. It is a binational state. It's just that it's never been recognized as such, but the reality on the ground is that it's already binational. And when commentators say that a binational Israel-Palestine would be violent and unstable, what they're really saying is that it would be violent and unstable if everyone could vote. As in, because it's already binational, but it's relatively stable because the IDF is keeping their boot on the neck of the Palestinians. And if we were to suddenly release the Palestinians and give them a vote, that would be what would make Israel-Palestine unstable and violent. But Beinart's point is, actually, no. Many political scientists, and he refers to an article in 2010 in World Politics, finds that ethnic groups are more likely to initiate conflict with the government the more excluded from state power they are. As in, you're not going to get instability if you don't exclude Palestinians from power. If we're talking equality, then you won't have instability. And the key example to that is Palestinian Israeli citizens. Palestinian Israeli citizens who do get a vote are overwhelmingly peaceful citizens who believe in democracy and equal rights, and they trust the Supreme Court in Israel. So we have an example that Palestinians are not genetically disinclined to democracy. Palestinian Israelis are the key example that it could actually be fine. The other thing to notice is that whilst economically there are huge chasms between Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza and Israelis, but all Palestinians are incredibly well educated. Both Israel and the occupied territories, literacy rates are 97%. And with democratic equality and liberal democracy, prosperity comes with such a stable and free system. How might it work? Here in the article, Beinart is less clear and less specific, which kind of makes sense. He's saying that it wouldn't quite be like South Africa, even though it might work like South Africa. But here there are two separate national identities of Jews and Palestinians, whereas in South Africa everybody saw themselves as South Africans, even though they were divided according to race. And so he refers to possibly Belgium or Northern Ireland. In Belgium, you've kind of got sort of three sections of the Dutch-speaking Finnish, the Walloons who are French-speaking, and a linguistically mixed kind of area where they have power sharing, or he also refers to Northern Ireland where there's care to make sure that both Catholics and Protestants have representation in the parliament. He talks about different options, confederalism, a land for all, which is an organisation trying to push for the idea that there would be two states within one land, so there'd be no borders, but somehow both peoples would have their own separate representation. And he also acknowledges, as Edward Said talked about, that we would need to trim the law of return together with the right of return of Palestinians. And he says that shouldn't prevent this Israel-Palestine entity from being a Jewish home. It would remain a refuge for Jews, just like it would be a refuge for Palestinians. The only thing is that a Jew from New York couldn't choose to make Aliyah one day and become a citizen the following day. What's the problem? What do we need to overcome is our fear. We are terribly frightened that without sovereignty, Israel's Jews would face mortal danger. But we need to remember that originally the early Zionists didn't talk about a state, they talked about autonomy. They talked about a Jewish home that could be autonomous, but they didn't need a state. There were many early Zionists who were not necessarily in favor of the idea of a state. What changed their minds was the Holocaust. The Holocaust suddenly said, oh my God, we are not safe. The Jews are not safe anywhere. We must have a state like every other people, because as a minority, it's never going to work. And the problem was that taking that Holocaustia approach, it meant that the Jews, and Israeli Jews in particular, have projected Nazism onto the Palestinians. And we've treated the Palestinians as if they're Nazis and Palestinian violence as if it's another Holocaust. But the thing is that Palestinians' rejectionism and their violence was inevitable. And even Jabotinsky, the key right-wing early Zionist, acknowledged that violence would come from the Palestinians, not because they're anti-Semitic, but because we've come in and taken over their land. And so their violence and rejectionism has been of a nationalist form. It hasn't been anti-Semitism as such, and they're certainly not the Nazis. For generations, Jews have seen a Jewish state as a tikkun, a repair, a way of overcoming the legacy of the Holocaust, but it hasn't worked. We are no longer under threat of annihilation. We haven't been for decades now. And in order for us to be free, we have to free the Palestinians and move on from our separatist idea of having two separate states, which are never going to happen, and move on from our idea of just living with the Palestinians being subjugated. We need to let go of our fear and move to equality between Jews and Palestinians rather than separation. So I think I've roughly given you the overview of the original article from Beinart, and now we're going to move on to the yes but. So for some of the yes but talks in specifics, and in particular I'm going to be drawing on Daniel Gordis, who's written an article and given various interviews dissing Beinart's article. So one of the things he says, the idea of Palestinian violence has severely decreased since 2005. He's saying, come on, all right, it's decreased since 2005, but in 2000 and 2001 and 2002 and 2003 it was incredibly high, and it wasn't that long ago. Everyone over 20 remembers it very, very painfully. And more importantly, what about Gaza? You're not mentioning the violence coming from Gaza, the amount of Qassam rockets that have been fired ever since the evacuation from Gaza. So come on, be honest with us. And likewise, here, Peter Beinart, you're talking about that if violence returns, then mass expulsion will begin. And you actually refer to Said Kashua, an Israeli-Palestinian novelist. When you follow the link that Beinart gives us, the proof text that if violence returns, mass expulsions will begin, he's referring to a novel. And that's not really serious. It's an imagination. It's not a political scientist giving a clear forecast. The critique goes on these bit by bit pieces. So Peter Beinart sees Ayman Uddeh as a role model, somebody who would support equality and would presumably be a leader in this new Palestine-Israel state. But he also says in the article, Beinart actually puts in the article, that Uddeh rejects a one-state solution. So there's something very strange. First of all, putting Uddeh as a possible saviour in Beinart's vision of a one-state solution that Uddeh himself rejects. And also there's something unsavoury about the American Jew totally ignoring the stated opinions of a Palestinian. Going further, the fact that US senators don't like the nation-state law, that's only 5. That raises a question about how significant these statistics are. And East Jerusalem could indeed be a vision if Palestinians voted, but they don't. So what kind of an example is that? Going further, how might it work? It's strange that South Africa is referred to, but at the same time it's not referred to, because there are two separate identities in Israel-Palestine, and in South Africa they're not. So the analogy breaks down. Even Beinart acknowledges that using Belgium as an example for how binationalism might work is seen to be something of a joke. Even in his own article, Beinart talks about how, because of this situation whereby power is shared between different nationalities, it took Belgium 589 days to form a government, which is longer than we've had during our 3 elections. And further than that, there are many commentators who talk about the deep problem that Belgium has with extremist terrorism finding a place in Belgium because they fit between the cracks. Because Belgium doesn't quite work as a nation state, there's been room for them to wheedle themselves between the different representations and fall between the cracks. He mentions Northern Ireland as well, and it's interesting, says Gordis, that European examples are being offered and not Middle Eastern examples, because what about Lebanon? Lebanon is also a binational state and having a terrible, terrible time. Why is that not referred to? Gordis suggests that Beinart is trying to pull the wool over our eyes, and in particular this idea of trimming the law of return, like who are you trying to fool? Gordis feels that this is not only an article which he disagrees with its argument, he is also disdainful of the way in which it plays fast and loose with what's fact, what's opinion, and what's just trying to pretend something doesn't exist. The big one, he talks about we're no longer under the threat of annihilation. Well, says Gordis in one of the interviews that he gave, that's because we have an army, Dumbo. The reason why we are relatively safe now is not because the rest of the world, Iran, Palestinians, Syria, it's not because they've suddenly decided that they like the Jews or accept them. It's because we've got a really strong army. And you're saying we need to hand over the army to the hands of the Palestinians who will now share use of it. That doesn't make sense. And he also says, Holocaust is your hang-up, Mr. Beinart. It's not the Israeli hang-up. It's true that the Holocaust has a hold over political rhetoric, but the lived experience of Israelis is not fear of Holocaust every day. And if it is, it's only about Iran, not the Palestinians. And more than that, and this one comes from other commentators as well, this whole understanding of the Israeli psyche as being based on Holocaust and Holocaust trauma is unbelievably Ashkenazi. It's an Ashkenazi thing to worry about the Holocaust, and Israel is becoming more and more Mizrahi. The majority of Israeli Jews are Mizrahim, and they're not obsessed with the Holocaust. There's another main critique which came from Yehuda Kurtzer, who's from the Shalom Hartman Institute, and he takes exception to the use of the image of Yavne. Kurtzer says, look, we're not talking a practical plan anyway. This isn't pragmatism. This is talking about changing the story, the narrative. And so I'm going to look at what image you're using, what metaphor you're using to argue for a different narrative. And so you're talking about Yavne. That's major. What's the image of Yavne? That the temple of the Jewish people is under siege, is about to be destroyed forever by the Romans. Yochanan ben Zakkai manages to smuggle himself out of a almost civil war within Jerusalem between zealots and pragmatists. And by some miracle, he ends up getting a meeting with the commander of the Romans. And the commander of the Romans, through another miracle, ends up offering Yochanan ben Zakkai anything that he wants. And Yochanan ben Zakkai does not ask for the Romans to leave Jerusalem alone. He just asks for Yavne and her sages. He basically says, just give me this university town way outside Jerusalem. But Kurtzer goes back to, hang on, so you're saying that this is a Yavne moment. So Yavne is the image of moving to a new paradigm because the old paradigm is destroyed, everything is in ashes. And Kurtzer says, are you really saying that you are comparing the fact, and Kurtzer doesn't argue with it, the fact that Israel is screwed up and Israel's treatment of the Palestinians is awful. Are you saying that that is the same as the destruction of the temple? Beinart seeing himself as the person being smuggled out of Jerusalem, like Yochanan ben Zakkai was smuggled in the coffin into exile? Well, first of all, that seems kind of arrogant that you're seeing yourself as Yochanan ben Zakkai. And to see an admittedly deeply flawed Israel as an analogy to the utter desolation of 2,000 years of Jewish longing is a weird idea, says Kurtzer. Also, Yavne is a symbol of pluralism. It's when the Jewish customs moved from being a centralized priesthood giving sacrifices in one temple to a place where everybody had their temple, rabbinical Judaism flourished, dialogue and discourse and pluralism flourished. And you're calling your article, which is going to split the Jewish people, you're calling that this is the symbol. And finally, you're telling Jews to get over their history. How can you be doing that when you're also referring back to Yavne? Kind of remember Yavne, but don't remember the Holocaust? Don't remember the fact that you've wanted sovereignty for 2,000 years? We invalidate our own history and our own story at our peril, especially if we do so in order to validate the story of Palestinians. Kurtz is saying, you, Beinart, you're in favour of Palestinians' narratives, but in so doing, you're also negating Jews' narratives. What's that about? That would be, I would say, the Kurtzer approach. He wrote an article which you can find online as well. And the final way of reading this article, I don't know whether it's a critique, but it's certainly a reading, is to 4HQ it. So let's 4HQ this question. He's certainly talking about to be. He very much addresses issues of security, fear throughout the article. He's also very much committed to freedom and equality. This whole idea of freeing the Palestinians so as to free ourselves. At the same time, when you look at it again, you're not quite sure whether this deserves a full V mark, a full tick, because the question of what the people actually want is kind of ignored, because as we know, most Palestinians and most Israelis don't want there to be a one-state solution. So we're actually going to give that a half. It doesn't really talk about our land, as in people's connection to the land, but he does talk about land very much and the idea that we need to take away the borders. The big lacuna, if we're talking 4HQ, in Beinart's article is about people. It's one of these really interesting things that Beinart has been attacked by many for being an American Jew who doesn't live in Israel, doesn't speak Hebrew, doesn't read Arabic. Who's he telling us what to do here? But funnily enough, although Beinart is writing as an American Jew, there's one thing that is very un-American about this article. It does not address identity politics. And if you would expect anything of a progressive American writer to address, it would be identity politics. He refers to Black Lives Matter, but he doesn't refer to identity politics in our area. And it's really strange that in some senses Americans can do identity politics and take them very seriously, but they get ignored when the American Jew looks at Israel. He doesn't address anything about Mizrahi identity, about the identity of Jews who've come from Arab lands. Nothing about the idea that Mizrahi identity may well actually have a lot more to do with ethnic solidarity and far less to do with liberal visions. He doesn't address Jewsraelis, the book and the research by Shmuel Rosner, which talks about how the majority of Jewish Israelis see their identity as melded, as national and religious. What are you going to do about that identity in this confederation of Israel-Palestine? It's not addressed in the article. And at the end of the day, both the article by Beinart and the responses to Beinart have mostly been given by Americans to Americans. And it may well be that a more useful way of understanding and reading this article is a conversation about the soul of the liberal Jewish American identity. How a liberal American Jew can maintain his or her connection to an Israel that seems unbearably and unredeemably broken. There you go. Really interested to hear your opinions. Please do come to the conversation after having seen this and encourage others to see this before they come to the conversation, and or read the articles yourselves and totally diss anything that I've said. All right then, see you soon.